As a J-1 researcher subject to the 2-year home residence rule, how do you avoid leaving the U.S. in the middle of your career? Let's imagine a story about a young, ambitious scientist named Maria. Maria is from Brazil and she's on the brink of making a huge discovery in microbiology. After she earned her PhD, she got a fantastic opportunity to work at a very important university in the US. To make her big move possible, she was given a J-1 visa. This is a special type of visa that the US gives to research scholars, professors, and other people who are involved in cultural exchange. Maria really dove into her new life in the US. Her research was going very well, and she felt she was just about to make a big scientific discovery. But there's a catch with her J-1 visa. Maria has to go back to Brazil for at least 2 years once her exchange program is over. This is called a 2-year home country requirement. Maria's research is at a very important point right now, and having to go back to Brazil for 2 years would really hurt her work. But there's something called a J-1 waiver. If Maria gets this waiver, she wouldn't have to go back to Brazil for 2 years. So, how do J-1 researchers like Maria become subject to the 2-year home residence rule? Well, it can happen in one of two ways. The first way is government funding. If the program in which Maria is participating is funded in whole or in part, directly or indirectly, by the U.S. government, such as the National Institutes of Health, for example, or the government of her home country, such as a federal university in the home country, she may become subject. This can include certain funding coming from international organizations where both the U.S. and the home country are members. The second way she can become subject is through specialized knowledge or skill. So this would occur if she were participating in a field of specialized knowledge or skill that is deemed necessary for the development of her home country. The Exchange Visitor Skills List by the U.S. Department of State specifies these fields for each country. If either of these circumstances apply, Maria must return to her home country for 2 years at the end of her exchange visitor program. This is also known as the home residence requirement or foreign residence requirement under the U.S. U.S. Immigration and Nationality Act, Section 212E. If Maria is not able or does not want to return to her home country to fulfill the 2-year requirement, she must obtain a J-1 waiver before she can change status in the United States or become a permanent resident. There are other strategies to fulfill the home residence requirement or even temporarily bypass it, which we'll address in future videos. But here, let's focus on J-1 waivers. There are 4 main types for researchers. First up, we have the no objection waiver, which tends to be the most popular waiver as well. The J-1's home country government sends a statement to the U.S. Department of State indicating that it has no objection to the J-1 not returning home to fulfill the 2 years, and no objection also to the possibility of the J-1 remaining in the United States and becoming a resident. This can be more difficult if home country funding is involved, but every country has different requirements for supporting such statements. The home country, typically through its embassy in Washington, D.C., will route its no objection statement to the U.S. Department of State, which will in turn send the matter on to USCIS for final approval. Next up, there is the request by an interested U.S. federal government agency. So many U.S. Federal agencies can sponsor a waiver if the J-1 is actively involved in a program sponsored by or of interest to the agency. So this could include the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, HHS, which can sponsor waivers for medical research, the National Science Foundation, NSF, which can sponsor waivers for non-medical research, as well as the U.S. Departments of Agriculture, Energy, Defense, Interior, and Transportation, which can all sponsor waivers if it is relevant to their mission. The agency will forward its waiver recommendation to the U.S. Department of State, which will then send the matter on to USCIS for final approval. Note that this is not a complete list of IGAs that will provide sponsorship. While only a few agencies have formal waiver policies, other atypical waivers may be possible with careful research, investigation, and advocacy. So, next up, we have our humanitarian-based J-1 waivers. For the hardship waiver, the J-1 must prove that his or her U.S. citizen or lawful permanent resident spouse or child would face exceptional hardship if the J-1 visitor had to live in the home country for 2 years. According to the U.S. government, a Exceptional hardship must be more than just the normal hardship, quote unquote normal hardship, expected from a temporary relocation or separation. We look at all the family circumstances, including medical, psychological, career, financial, and sociocultural hardship in the event of either the scenario of a family separation or where the family relocates to the home country. We also look at country conditions, travel warnings, etc. in the home country. An application for this waiver is filed directly with USCIS, and following a determination of initial eligibility, then moves to the U.S. Department of State for a recommendation, with that recommendation ultimately back to USCIS for the final decision. Finally, let's talk about the hardship or the persecution waiver, where the J-1 must establish that he or she would be subject to persecution on account of race, religion, or political opinion. As with a hardship waiver, an application for this waiver is also filed directly with USCIS. Following a determination of initial eligibility, it then moves to the Department of State for a recommendation, and with that recommendation, ultimately back to USCIS for the final decision. U.S. government funding can cause other complications that can make many of these waivers significantly harder. Remember that each of these waivers has its own set of requirements and processes. It's really important to understand these details, talk with an experienced attorney prior to filing. Hope this video was helpful. If you are a J-1 researcher, if you have any questions about different types of J-1 waivers, please do feel free to leave them in the comments below. There are often options, and I'm happy to help you. Thanks for watching, and I'll talk to you soon.